Companies are spending more right now on artificial intelligence than any other technology in history. And the primary thing that most of them are using to evaluate whether it's working is whether people are logging in. But usage is not the metric the board is going to ask you about.
Hey there, senior leader, and welcome to the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is, as you know, where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. I'm your host, Jackson Lynch, and today I am joined by my co-host, Scott Morris. He's a former CHRO with the scar tissue to prove it, the alleged survivor of more vendor demos than any human being should ever be asked to endure, and is now a vendor and the founder of Propulsion AI. Scott, I want to start with a number that I think most people in our audience already know, but has not yet been named clearly. Globally, enterprises are on track to invest over $1 trillion with a T in AI this year. And according to nearly every major research firm tracking this, more than 90% of that investment is not producing measurable business results yet. Now, I don't think that's a technology failure. I think it's a implementation failure. I think it traces back to a single question being asked in the wrong order.
I agree with you. But before we go any further, I just want to be clear, Jackson, with our audience that this is not a diagnosis from the outside. You've watched the patterns. I've watched these patterns run inside organizations at every level. And I lead a technology company. This is pattern recognition from being in those rooms when the decisions got made.
And that's exactly where this conversation needs to start, Scott, because these are not careless mistakes. They're very logical and rational ones.
So before we get going, Jackson, I want to say a big thank you, and I know you do too. A shout out this week to Shannon from Plymouth Meeting, Pennsylvania. Shannon, thank you so much for being a part of the Talent Sherpa community. It genuinely means a lot to Jackson and I that you're here. And thank you to everyone else for tuning in. Whether you're joining us from Oakville, Ontario, or Smyrna, Georgia, we're really glad you showed up today. Let's get going.
Yeah, it means everything, and we'll do our best to make sure it's worth your time.
Hey, Jackson, just one more thing before we get going. Let me ask the audience, take a second right now, just take 30 seconds actually, and think about a performance problem that you're focused on. Now, ask yourself honestly, is this about a person? Or is it about how the system around that person was designed? And Jackson, the reason I'm asking the audience that is that a recent graduate of your CHRO Ascent Academy described the organizational design module that you run this way. Immediately relevant. Said, we applied the techniques that same week. What you're building inside of the CHRO Ascent Academy is a program for CHROs who are learning to read the difference before they act and not after. Seats are limited in this program, and I would highly recommend everybody goes to www.mytalentsherpa.com and figure out how to get into the CHRO Ascent Academy with Jackson. It's well worth it for you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And we have the next one kicking off here May 15th. So let's get into this episode. Here's where we are today. Global AI spending is projected to surpass $1.3 trillion by the end of 2026. 85% of organizations increased their AI investment in the past 12 months. That number actually feels low to me. The commitment is serious and it's growing. And the board conversation about AI return on investment is no longer optional.
Yeah, and the ROI just isn't following, and that's why we're raising this point. Research from multiple firms is landing roughly in the same place. 95% of AI pilots are failing to deliver any kind of measurable P&L impact. Only 14% of CFOs that got surveyed said that they saw a way that they could point to a clear, measurable return on the money that they had invested in AI. Not insignificantly, IBM found that only 25% of organizations report AI delivering any kind of expected ROI. And 42% of companies abandon most of their AI projects in 2025 before the measurement conversation even happened. Now, I know that's a lot of numbers, but here's the take. It isn't working.
Yeah, that was a lot of math. And here's what I think is underneath all that data. The spending is real. The technology is genuinely impressive. And the tools probably do what the vendors say they do. But the question that most organizations are asking when they enter an AI deployment is, how can we use this? And that question, asked first, almost always produces bad outcomes. And that's because it puts the technology before the problem. You end up with a solution before you've named the constraint.
I want to put a real example to this. I worked in manufacturing and I watched this happen in a manufacturing company that was excited about AI for workforce scheduling, genuinely excited. But when someone stopped and asked what was actually constraining the operation, the answer wasn't scheduling. It was unplanned downtime. And the scheduling tool would have made, an existing problem marginally more efficient. The constraint, once you named it, pointed out something that was completely different insofar as an AI application, predictive maintenance. And, at the business case for that was more than 3 times larger.
Look, that I've seen that too. And the gap between the tool being evaluated and the constraint actually limiting the business is where most of that $1 trillion are going to disappear. Because when you start with a tool, you solve the problem the demo describes, which, by the way, is what human capital leaders do often. They try to find the problem in the organization that they can solve with the program that they've already built. That doesn't always drive where the business problem lives.
And I think boards are starting to notice that, Jackson. 61% of CEOs say that they are under increasing pressure to show some kind of return on AI compared to just a year ago. And that pressure is arriving faster than most organizations have built the infrastructure to answer. And then the CHRO who can walk into that conversation with a constraint-first framework is operating at a very different altitude than the one who walks in with an adoption dashboard.
Yeah. And that difference, that altitude difference, is what this episode is going to be about. So let's start off by naming the assumptions that get the organization stuck here, because they don't persist because people are careless. Each one makes sense in the room that it's made in.
Start with the one I keep running into.
Okay, so the first one sounds like this. We bought the AI module, so we are going to be doing AI. And I understand where that comes from. The purchase was approved. It might have been in your existing tech stack. I don't know. But you end up rolling it out, and that's happening. And something real feels like it's occurring. But buying a tool is not the same as deploying a capability against a problem. And deploying a capability is not even the same as solving a business problem. 3 different things. And most organizations are celebrating after the first one.
And the signal that this assumption is running the room is when the all hands announcement about the new platform lands with more energy than the conversation about what the platform is supposed to change, right? The purchase becomes the proof point, which means that the question that actually about what actually changed in the business never gets asked.
So let's move forward. The second one, I think, sounds like patience, but actually in practice is more like avoidance. The return on investment will reveal itself once adoption is high enough. And look, adoption might be a legitimate thing to track. Might not be. Jury's out. But usage tells you that people are using the tools. It tells you nothing about whether the tool is moving a business outcome that anyone cares about.
I've sat in renewal conversations where the vendor came in with, and this wasn't on AI, but same concept, right? Vendor came in with strong adoption data, and everybody in the room nods because the counter argument requires a measurement framework that never got built. You can't dispute the adoption numbers if you never established what the business outcome was supposed to be. The assumption protects itself.
And that leads, I think, directly to the third one. The business case follows the investment. We will figure out the ROI story once we have the data. Now, no one goes into it and actually thinks in those terms. Maybe sometimes organizations genuinely believe that, but I think more often it's a signal that the constraint was never named before the tool was selected. And when the constraint's not named, there is nothing to build the business case around.
You're buying technology to buy and deploy technology. Now, here's one that's I think the hardest to name in the room, because it sounds like cost discipline. The goal of AI is to reduce headcount. I totally object to this. I run, as you know, an artificial intelligence company. I object to this argument. Get the humans out and get the costs down. And I'll be honest, I've been in multiple executive conversations where that was the primary logic and nobody challenged it because it sounds responsible. But I think it's completely wrongheaded.
It is. And here's where the logic, I think, breaks down. It's not even logical on the face because most prior technology deployments were about making humans faster at existing work. Spreadsheets made finance faster than when they were using Abacus or Abacus I. I don't know what the plural of an Abacus is, but CRMs made sales faster, even though every salesperson complains about having to use it. The mental model that organizations have carried into AI is the same one, but I think AI is genuinely different. It allows organizations to reimagine the distribution of work between tools and humans and full-time and part-time gig workers. It allows you to rethink that whole thing, which means that when you deploy it well, you almost certainly do have additional human cycles available. But the question is, what do you do with those cycles? That's where, in my view, the real strategic opportunity lives.
You're going to get zero argument from me on that. I think you've named it perfectly. Wrong-headed organizations are asking, how do we get humans out of this work? Right-headed ones are asking, how do we take pieces of their work, utilize artificial intelligence and other technologies to do those pieces, and redeploy those cycles so that we're increasing capacity? How do we double innovation? How do we serve the customer in ways that we never have had the cycles to do before?
And there's a real forecast out there about what happens when organizations choose that very first path at scale. When enough enterprises eliminate rather than redeploy, I think you're going to find power is going to concentrate in fewer hands. And the people that are running those organizations end up with enormous leverage for a little bit and almost no bench beneath them. The people, however, who redeployed thoughtfully ended up with organizations that are faster, deeper, and harder to compete against. A real good example of that is IBM, right? They re-looked at all of their entry-level positions, used AI to redesign the work, and then reset the expectations, the outcome clarity for those roles, and now is hiring 3x what they have been doing historically. You won't necessarily see that today, and if you do, it's probably an increased cost. What you will see is a decreased cost, an increased bench strength, and a more well-developed next rung of leaders 3, 5, 10 years from now. The folks that just pull all of that to the bottom line, they're going to have to spend more money to fill those gaps as we look into the future, I think.
And I think that conversation is why it's so important for CHROs to be engaged in this discussion. Our job in AI deployment is to enable technology and run change management and train the users and track adoption, and all of those things matter. And I don't think you and I are arguing the opposite. But if that is where the CHRO's role starts and ends, then the CHRO is at the wrong level because they're not talking about the constraints of the business.
Yeah, I agree. The CHRO who treats AI governance as an enablement function is I think they're handing away their most important capital allocation role in the enterprise, not only right now, but like in the next 5 to 10 years. The constraint identification, business case design, redeployment planning, reallocation of time that's been found and put towards other things. That's where the strategic work is. If HR is not in the conversation, somebody else is going to be. And they're going to come into it with their own lenses, right? Finance will come into it with a cost lens. Legal is going to come into it with a compliance lens. The IT folks are going to probably have a security lens. We're the only ones sitting in the enterprise that have the mandate, or we should have the mandate, to look across the entire organization and figure out how do you have a workforce optimization mechanism. And that's what this is about. You don't do it that way, I don't think it's going to go well.
You and I are going to get into what to do about this. But before we do that, I want to name the structural mechanism that's underneath all of this. Because if we don't, the fixes that people reach for treat symptoms. And there are actually two reinforcing loops that are running at the same time.
All right. Why don't you take the first one?
Okay. I think you and I call it the constraint inversion loop. Vendor brings a demo.
Really cool titles for these. Where do you come up with this?
You would almost think we planned that out.
Okay. Sorry.
Constraint Don't derail the audience, Jackson. The constraint inversion loop. Vendor brings a demo, and the demo is genuinely impressive, and it usually does exactly what it claims. And then someone in the room sponsors the purchase based on what they saw, not based on the defined constraint the organization has agreed to eliminate and thought about it.
Right.
Deployment begins. The question that everybody asks is, how do we get people to use this? Which is a totally legitimate question. The more important question is, what business result have we committed to moving? And that question never gets asked because there's no constraint at the other end to measure against. So adoption numbers come in and leadership is satisfied because people are using the system and the loop resets.
Yeah. I've seen that. And to be really clear about it, no one in that loop is actually doing anything wrong. Maybe the vendor.
I've done it.
The vendor usually hasn't even seen the technology that they're selling. At least that's my experience. When the folks come in to actually do the implementation, they're like, "Yeah, we've never heard of that feature." Maybe that's just my vendor management history. I think everyone is trying to do their job, and they're trying to do it in a good way. The problem is structural. To your point, the constraint was never named. You're not trying to figure out what it is. What's the business problem you're solving? So there's nothing left to hold the loop accountable to. And so the loop runs clean precisely because it has no accountability architecture attached to it by naming the constraint, that business problem you're trying to relax, that you're trying to solve.
Let me do the second one, which is the distribution of work blind spot. And this is the one I think that explains why the elimination impulse is so present among even thoughtful leaders. Every major technology wave before this one has been one fundamentally about making humans faster. You said that just a few minutes ago. Faster at existing work. Organizations carry that model into AI, deploy the tool, make the humans faster, measure the efficiency gain, and nobody ever thinks about making the job different.
Yeah. But AI allows organizations to restructure what tasks belong to machines, what require people, where the human is in the loop, where human is above the loop, which I think you're going to hear more and more about. We talked about the orchestration layer when Stephanie was here, 4 months ago. I'm starting to hear it in the community today. But as you kind of step back, it's fundamentally different. That's a different capability than accelerating the existing workflow. And when you apply the old mental model to the new kind of tool, you might actually see the efficiency gain, or you're going to reach for the cost reduction. The headcount elimination feels like the logical conclusion. The actual opportunity, I think, goes unexamined, and importantly, because the time period that you're trying to solve for is smaller and it is too precise, and you haven't tried to solve for the larger piece, which is how do I best put my company in a position to win over time, not how do I do this thing now.
And the opportunity that you're talking about right there is that freed human cycles can go someplace really meaningful. More customer contact, more innovation, more of the strategic work that the business has always wanted to do, but has said that they didn't have capacity for. Right? The organizations that see that clearly are compounding an advantage. The ones that eliminate and move on are cashing a one-time check. And those look like the same thing for about 18 months, and then they look really, really different.
So then how does the CHRO actually change it? Let me frame it as the constraint-first framework, another fancy title that we may or may not have talked about before. 5 moves. And the sequence here, I think, matters as much as the moves themselves. So the first one is identify the constraint. Before any vendor conversation, before any demo, before any budget request, if you're a sitting CHRO, facilitate the conversation with business leadership that answers one question. What is holding this business back right now? Not what would be useful, not where could we find efficiency. What constraint, if eliminated, would change the trajectory of the business? And if you can get that question answered honestly, it should govern everything that follows.
And it sounds obvious until you try to do it in an organization where the vendor is already in and building, and the board is asking why you aren't moving faster on artificial intelligence. The discipline to stop, to name the constraint that you are talking about, and to insist that the answer governs which tool gets evaluated. That discipline is harder than it looks from the outside.
Oh, it totally is, because the pressure from the board and from the CEO is real. But let's talk about the second one. And that move is to vision the unconstrained state. So What would this business look like if that constraint didn't exist? How would it operate differently? How would it advance? This step matters because it creates the measurement framework before the tool is ever selected, right? You know what you're solving for. It comes back to clarity. It's something we talk about all the time on the pod. If you know what the unconstrained state looks like, you know what success looks like, you can define it, and that allows you to then build the real business case.
I found that question to be the most clarifying question that you can ask of your CEO, and probably the most clarifying conversation that you can have with your CEO. I use that question a lot. In fact, you and I did an episode where we're talking about, do you take the job as a CHRO, right? And a part of my calculus on that has always been, can you have that conversation about constraints with the CEO in a meaningful way? Because most senior leaders aren't regularly asked to describe their business without its primary constraint. They're so deep into managing around all of it that the unconstrained state has never really been made concrete for them. And when you make it concrete, tool selection starts to get a lot more obvious. And the ROI conversation becomes a whole lot more straightforward.
Yeah, I go back to my time in the PepsiCo organization, and we would figure out ways to have operational efficiency gains inside of our plants that no one else could ever even imagine. And that was the exact way that they looked at it. What would an unconstrained world look like? And then what are the constraints that are getting in that way? And then let's go figure out how we get the best minds in the organization focused in on that and then deploy it across the company. And that's how you ended up with quarter after quarter after quarter, these productivity gains. When you do it well, this isn't theoretical. I've seen it done, and it makes good sense. So let's talk about the third move then is select the actual tool. Now, I point this out because it's step 3. It's not step 1. Once the constraint is named and the unconstrained state is defined, the question has to become, what capability in the AI tool bag addresses that specific constraint? And here's where AI being a tool bag rather than a single thing also matters. Agentic, generative models, predictive systems, automation frameworks, probably 15 more that are going to be discovered by the time between when we tape this and when it goes live, but each is going to address different kinds of constraints. You need the constraint named before the tool can be selected if you want to do it smartly.
Just a few minutes ago, we were talking about, give me a tool and then I'll figure out the ROI for it. The CHRO that goes into a vendor conversation with really well-defined constraints and then says to the vendor, I don't want your demo, right? I want you to talk about how you're going to solve these constraint problems for me with the tool set that you have. And if you can't do it, then fine. But that's an indicator to me that it's probably not the right tool. That CHRO is having a fundamentally different conversation than the one who says, okay, I'm ready for your demo. A vendor who can't answer the question is just selling you a tool, and kind of like going down to Home Depot and buying a tool, right? If you don't know the use case for it, then buying the tool might not be the right move for you, right? A vendor who can solve your problem, a named constraint, that's the person you want to talk to. But that really flips the script on what the demo is. You want that second kind. And you're not going to find that if you just let them drive their demo.
Now, I do want to push back on you because there is a value to just going to Home Depot or Lowe's and buying a tool. I have consistently enjoyed buying tools. Unfortunately, my problem is I can't fix anything. So I will spend 3 times on the same project. Once to buy all the tools and try it myself. Once to pay someone to fix what I just broke. And third, to get it right the third time. But that does not take away the optimism and hope that I feel every time I go in and I buy a brand new tool for something I know is probably going to get screwed up. But that's
I don't throw stones on fixing things because I'm less handy than you are. So I think we better move to the 4th one.
As I've gotten older, I've realized my superpower skill is writing a check for someone that knows what they're doing. But here's the 4th move. Design the business case. Define how you will know if you've succeeded. So what we've really thought about here is the same thing we talked about for job clarity up front. You're doing this for this kind of intervention as well. What measurements will the business take in that if that constraint is truly eliminated should show movement? And then you build the business case around that before you go into the deployment. And that should give you the ability to have early detection system, because without that, you don't have any accountability architecture. You can't prove that you moved something that you didn't identify and measure before you started.
I think that's a really important feature, and I think people should double click on that. And I'll tell you the other one. The business case that we're talking about needs to have a component that most are missing, and that's what are you going to do with the free capacity? You have to think through that, because when AI eliminates, or any technology to be honest, eliminates a constraint, then human cycles become available. And that's a part of the return on the investment. And you have to think about how you're going to redeploy those once you capture them. It belongs inside the business case before the deployment begins.
Yeah. Which is the fifth move. Plan the redeployment before the tool goes live. So just double clicking on what you said there, Scott, because you got to figure out what those freed human cycles are going to do. What is the business going to do with that capacity that it didn't previously have? Think about it this way. There are things that if we had an extra day a week, you would focus your discretionary effort towards, and you would have an outsized impact on the business. Figure out what those are upfront, because if you do know what they are, whether it's more innovation or deeper customer relationships, or in the human resources area, like more time building the capability than managing compliance to a process, like whatever the new capabilities are that the business has always wanted to build, if you define those well up front, then you can redeploy it as part of the business case. If you don't do that, what happens? The cost savings get sucked in, and next thing you know, you have a less cost, similar capable organization, which is not bad, but you're not actually using this to deliver the growth that might be there. So the ones that are actually, I think, getting it right are the ones that have a redeployment plan in place and identified and aligned before it goes live. Where does the free capacity go? What does the business need to do with it that we couldn't do before? And that is the question that I think turns an efficiency gain into a much more strategic outcome.
I want to do those one more time really quickly so that everybody's got them front of mind. Constraint first, unconstrained state for the business second, tool selection third, business case fourth, redeployment plan fifth. Run those in order, and the ROI conversation has a real answer for you. You've built a measurement framework before you've made the investment, and you know exactly what you're moving and exactly why and exactly what the numbers should look like.
Okay, so here is how the CHRO can move on this starting this week. So play number one, run the constraint audit. Sit down with your CEO and your CFO, maybe some of your operators, and ask the question, if we could eliminate one structural constraint in the business in the next 12 months, 6 months, not much longer than that, what would it be? And don't bring in the technology solution to that conversation. Bring the question, write down the answer, and then use that answer as the starting point for every AI investment decision that's going forward.
Play number two, have the unconstrained state conversation. Take the constraint that you just identified, go back to the CEO with a follow-up and ask, what would the business look like if that constraint was gone? How would it operate? How would it advance? Get really specific. Ask your CEO to be really specific. Revenue impact, speed to market, talent density in pivotal roles. Make it concrete enough to measure against. The picture is the architecture that your business case is going to get built on in about 2 moves.
I think that's right on. And here's play number 3. Reframe the next vendor conversation. Before your next vendor meeting, prepare 3 questions. What constraint does this tool eliminate? Or at least relax. What does the business look like after that constraint is gone? And what's the measurement framework that you would use to prove the constraint's been eliminated? Now, a vendor who can't answer those questions is selling adoption. They're selling a solution to a problem that may not exist. A vendor who can identify those things is selling outcomes. You want to be in the room with the second kind.
And you know what, Jackson, I think we've got to run those kind of interviews when we're talking to those vendors. Know your questions up front, make them connect to those constraints, but then run it like an interview. Would you let a candidate get away with a non-answer? You should not let the vendor get away with a non-answer too. Play number 4, design the redeployment plan before the tool goes live, especially if you are investing in artificial intelligence in your current pipeline. You need to write a specific answer to the question before deployment. And the question is, where are the freed human cycles going to go? Because they are, in fact, a part of the return on your investment. You don't want that in general terms. You want it in specific terms. Which roles, which capabilities, which business outcomes will absorb the capacity that this tool frees up? What more are you going to be able to do in the business and where? And if you can't really answer that question, then the investment isn't ready to move forward because you don't know how to measure the return on that investment. The redeployment plan is what separates business outcomes from an efficiency number.
Yeah, and let me just double click on that because I think it's important. We're not presuming that the right answer is redeployment. That is going to be a business by business, context by context situation. There may be times where the right answer is you take all of that savings and you put it to the bottom line. There may be times where you have things that you need to overinvest in that you haven't been able to figure out a way to do and focusing on it that way. But the key is you do all that work up front and you build it as part of the business case. And then as we've talked about, as you do process design, play 5 talks about installing a constraint review cadence. Okay, so what does that mean? It means you think about one question that you add into every business planning cycle, every quarterly review. What's constraining the business right now, and has the answer changed? And that question, I think, keeps the tool selection honest, and it surfaces new AI applications as the business evolves. And that, by the way, includes answering, have we redeployed it, and have we gotten the benefit from that redeployment that we were expecting? If the CHRO owns that cadence, they own the AI accountability conversation. They do it for the entire enterprise, and that's the position you want to be in.
And that fifth play has the longest tail, and the constraint, and the reason it has a long tail is that the constraint is changing as the business evolves. What's constraining the business this year is not what is likely going to be constraining the business in 2 years from now. Most strategy frameworks get referenced at planning time and kind of ignored the rest of the year, at least. I mean, I laugh because I think I've been guilty of that. But a quarterly constraint review prevents that, right? The question stays live because it's a calendared conversation.
Okay, senior leaders, this is your favorite part of the pod. It's your Talent Sherpa summary, or as Scott always says, the best AI strategy is to buy everything that impressed you in the demo and then wait for the business to figure out what problem it solves.
Oh my gosh, no, please don't do that. I never said that, and I'm never going to say that, especially not around my own solution. All right, here we go, Jackson. 1, global AI investment is at historic highs and ROI isn't following it. 95% of AI pilots are failing to deliver measurable P&L impact, and that gap isn't a technology problem. It's a sequencing problem. Organizations are selecting tools before they've named constraints. Number 2, the assumptions that keep organizations stuck are predictable and they're self-reinforcing. Buying AI is doing AI somehow, and adoption, people using whatever it is, equals value, and neither of those are true. The business case follows the investment. Headcount reduction is the win, right? All of these things are false. Each one makes sense in the room when you're talking about it, but it produces the same outcome. Significant spend, no business result attached to it. Number 3, AI is just fundamentally different than prior technologies, and we have to think about it differently because it allows organizations to reimagine the distribution of work between humans and tools, not only to make humans faster at what they do right now, but to make the work different, and you have to rethink the work that the humans are doing. So organizations applying the old mental model are going to cash a check on one-time efficiency, but the ones that are applying the new mental model are compounding a structural advantage, redeploying their human capital. 4th and final, constraint-first framework. That's the sequence that the 5 moves have to be performed in. Identify the constraint, vision the unconstrained state of the org, find a tool that's going to help you move from one to the next, design the business case for it, and plan the redeployment of human capital. Every CHRO who runs those 5 moves in that order is having a fundamentally different AI conversation than most organizations are currently having. And that's the one that's going to produce the ROI.
Yeah, what I keep coming back to from this conversation, Scott, is the redeployment question. Most AI conversations end at the efficiency number. The right ones start with, what do you do with the capacity we free up? Redeployment is a strategic expansion question. It's got to be tied specifically to the context in which you're operating. Where does the free capacity go? What can the business do with it that it could not do before? And the CHROs who are asking that question, they're shaping what the organizations are capable of becoming. That is the altitude that this moment demands. Now, I want to say thank you so much for tuning into the Talent Sherpa podcast. This is, as you know, where senior leaders come to rethink how human capital really works. And this is so much fun to do with y'all.
You know, if you liked today's episode, please do Jackson and I a favor and hit the like button right now, or better yet, subscribe to the podcast so that you get new episodes delivered to you. Leave us a review on your favorite platform, whether that's Apple Podcasts or Spotify or YouTube. We're everywhere on that one. So it would benefit us. It benefits the community. Take a moment, hit subscribe, leave us a review. It's free. It helps us, and it helps us reach more senior leaders.
Yeah, and I want to talk a little bit about Scott's company for a second. Propulsion AI is workforce intelligence for private equity. Their AI teammates are surfacing workforce risk before they close, and they're helping leadership teams drive execution after. They translate strategy into individual accountability. They coach managers to define roles by outcomes, and they give every employee a clear line of sight to what actually matters. That's all good stuff, Scott. All through artificial intelligence. And you can learn more at the very cleverly named getpropulsion.ai.
You know, I said it at the top of the episode. I'll say it one more time. If you are a CHRO that's new to your role, or you're preparing to step into a CHRO role, Jackson has built a bunch of tools to help you operate at the altitude that role demands. Personal coaching, the Ascent Academy, his best-selling Substack. Everything that you need, you can find at mytalentsherpa.com.
Thanks, Scott. And thanks to everyone who is listening today. Until next time, keep raising the bar. Please start with the constraint before you start with the tool, and keep on climbing.